Welcome to the Story 516 podcast, where we sit down with Christians from across denominations and talk about how God is at work in the world today and inspire you to see God at work in your own life in new ways. Well, welcome back to the Story 516 podcast. My name is Zach, your host, and today I am joined by a friend of mine, Faith Blum. Faith, welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
Yeah, so we go back a handful of years.
Yep.
Um, on a previous episode, I talked to Kellen Roth, and we all kind of I got to know both of you at around the same time, going through writing coaching, and then partnering with both of you to teach some writing lessons, and then fast forward a few years, and I got reconnected with both of you through the Author Conservatory as a student, and now as a part-time staff member there as well. So that's my brief bio of you. But as always, each individual has a much better bio than I could just give in 30 seconds. So I would love to hear kind of your own brief bio to share with the audience.
Well, one thing that I want to mention is because I was talking to my mom today about this, and I'm like, we met online like 8 years ago, but we only live about 6 hours away, but we finally met in person in June of this year.
I know.
So, and we had to go to Chicago to do it. Um, so I don't know. I think that's fun.
Yeah,
Or
that is
funny,
funny.
fun,
It took
funny, both, all.
Yep, it took 8 years and a 12-hour drive for me to meet someone who lives like 6 hours away.
Yes.
Which is like the backwards way of doing this. And then there were like other people who like lived farther and I knew a lot less that I met way earlier. And it was just like what I feel I'm doing life wrong.
Anyway, so quick brief bio of myself. I'm Faith Blum, as Zach mentioned. I am a wife, a mom, an author, slightly entrepreneurish, I guess. I mean, I'm a self-published author, so therefore entrepreneur. I've published over 30 books. Most of them are Christian historical fiction, and I love stories because they can teach history, but in a fun way. And it's also my way to have a creative outlet while taking care of a preschooler. And also, I'm expecting in February. So, actually, by the time this podcast comes out, I'll probably already have a newborn. But as we're recording it, she's not here yet. But it'll be a nice creative outlet when I have a newborn as well. And when I'm not writing, you can find me baking sourdough, cooking gluten free food, or spending time outside with my very energetic 4.5-year-old. But I also enjoy playing piano. And as Zach already mentioned, we both work for the Author Conservatory.
Yeah. When I talked to Kellen and then now talking with you, I recorded both of these kind of within a week of each other. I was full transparency to the audience. It's the end of 2024. I'm on Christmas break. So I was like, let's be super productive and schedule as many interviews and batch create for 2025, which is kind of cool because a theme kind of came up in terms of a lot of the interviews I was able to schedule because um, it's a, I mean, like the first place often we look for connection are the social circles that we already have established. And one of mine is a strong social circle of writers. So I realized, oh, 2025 is going to have a really large bent of interviews with writers and creative people like that. So I think that's really cool. And I know you and Kellen both write similar in terms of like historic fiction stuff that I'm admittingly too scared to write myself.
A lot. I've heard that. I've heard that.
I don't know what it is. It's like the thought of researching like medieval warfare. I'm like, cool, I can use that in fantasy. But the thought of researching like even though it's the exact same thing basically, but you just add on like what was actually happening in that historic time. For some reason, that's just too daunting.
And it's funny because I purposely write historical fiction because I don't wanna have to make up my own stuff. I'd rather use the real world stuff instead of having to be like, "Alright, so what should the holidays be like in
Right.
this random world that I just created?" Or all of these other things, it's like, I can research what did they do during just for example, because I researched this somewhat recently, what were the differences for Mexican Christmas in the 1800s versus German Christmas in the 1800s? And how could I meld those together? Because I had this couple that he was German, she was Mexican. And then so they melded their families together and created their own traditions through that. Um, so I'd rather research that than have to come up with that myself.
Yeah, I guess I'm just the opposite in that
Yeah.
where I'm like, "Oh, I can come up with my own holiday. That's awesome." The one thing I will give that like the one area I'm really jealous of contemporary and historic writers is it's way easier for you all to write off a trip for tax purposes for research because it's like, "Hey, I'm writing about Ireland. So I'm going to go to Ireland and count that as a research trip." Whereas if I'm writing like a fantasy world, Ireland doesn't exist. So I have to get like more creative and like turn my head to the side and like squint to like fully write it off where it's like, this is inspired by Ireland in these very specific ways to justify this as a tax trip.
Right.
So clearly, I haven't done any of that yet for myself. But I do think it's cool, and I'm really excited as I kind of dive into all these interviews with writers myself to see how the same kind of field, general field of writing, how that has given people unique views on seeing God working in the world today. Because here at the Story 516 podcast, that's kind of our big question is how do we see God at work in the world today? It's based on um, the idea that we all have stories. And then the book of Matthew from the Bible, chapter 5, verse 16, is the one where it talks about letting your light, your works shine before men that they might see what you do and glorify God. So the idea that what we do in life is our story, and those stories are supposed to be like a mirror reflecting God. So I'm really excited myself, selfishly, but also to share it with the audience, talking with all these writers in 2025 here to see how writing can be viewed through these different life experiences, through these different perspectives, to see how God's showing up in the world today. So, as a super, super easy, seamless transition, I would love to start talking about how you have seen God work in the world today, whether that's through any specific writing examples you have, or kind of like you shared, you have done a lot. You've had lots of experiences in your life. So I would love you just to uh, take that question kind of where you will, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, I know, I was thinking through this question, I'm like, I could take this so many ways, but I'm actually gonna talk about the one that does include taking a break from my writing. Um, so, um, as I mentioned, I'm pregnant. Pregnancy kinda drains me. It drains a lot of people who are, who have experienced that. By the end of 2024, I realized, well, actually, technically, it was like November or something like that. I realized I am creatively and mentally burned out. I don't want to do anything writing related. I can't. I was trying to write actually the story I mentioned that has the she has a German dad and a Mexican mom. I was trying to write that story and it just was not working. So something that I guess I've seen so a place that God has I've seen God working in my world at least right now is just showing me that breaks can actually be a good thing. And for someone who always needs to be doing something, this has been a hard lesson the last 2 months. But it has also been really good, and I've just been working on focusing more on getting the things that I have to get done, focusing more on trying to be a little bit more present for my son, and just kind of trying to revive my own creativity, I guess. My word for 2025 actually is creativity. Surprise, surprise. So I'm working on more trying to not force things that just aren't working. So just working on more of that creativity and yeah, just kind of going into 2025 with that mindset of being okay with actually taking breaks, especially as I get ready for a newborn.
When a big life transition happens like that, do you find God kind of showing up and talking to you in a different way than he normally does?
Yeah, I think so. Uh, like I said, with the whole creative burnout and everything, I've been working more on just general work stuff, plus keeping the house a little bit cleaner than I maybe was before. um, and just trying to see God in other ways than just my writing.
I can see where it can be really helpful to kind of have those times where you like step back from one venture or one whether it's a hobby or more career related that you work really hard at getting better at, but being able to like step back from that and pivot to something else and almost it, I think it almost gives you like a different way of seeing life, which I'm guessing can be really helpful to kind of just stretch different either creative muscles or just reframe your own experience and your own, I guess, view on life. Kind of like a really silly example would be if your hobby is playing video games all the time and then you take a step back from that and take up bird watching, all of a sudden, like you're outside, you're down by the lake looking for birds. So you're able to like completely see the world in a new light. So I bet that's something that like a lot of people can incorporate into their own life to different extents, even trying it for like a week or something. Almost like I have a lot of uh growing up, I've had a lot of friends who have done some sort of like fasting from an activity for like Lent or just for some other reason. And that can be something you can kind of implement at any time, kind of stepping back from something that takes up effort and time and kind of pivoting focus to something else.
Yeah, and I think for me, it's kind of been a little bit more of instead of focusing on my writing, which reaches people outside of my house mostly, focusing more on teaching my son some of the lessons that I've learned through the years about the Bible and God and all that. So yeah, yeah, you can definitely your focus has to change sometimes, and that's okay. And maybe once the kids are all grown up, I'll be able to do a little bit more with my writing than I am now. But right now, I think my focus has to be a little bit more in the home.
Yeah, well, that brings up a really interesting topic that I've not experienced because I don't have any kids right now. When you're kind of approaching your child and teaching them about life, about God, how does that or how has that kind of impacted your own view of God?
I think I'm kind of seeing, I don't know, going back to that child's view of God again in some ways because my son is 4.5 years old. Was it yesterday or the day before? We were in the car and he asks, "Does God know when we're going to die?" I'm like, Why are you asking this question? Yes, God knows when we're gonna die. Can you ask him when that's going to be? I'm like, um, these questions, like, where is this question coming from, first of all? And I'm like, well, God doesn't usually let us know when we're gonna die. I'm like, I had no idea how to answer the question. I just like trying to get him to stop asking. But it's just like, yeah, he comes up with the most random questions that are like really deep. And I'm like, I have no idea. This worldview class and all of these things, they did not prepare me to answer these questions.
Oh, I love that. Like, I've had the experience, somewhat recently talking to middle schoolers in a few different contexts, and something that's, like, both absolutely terrifying, but also kind of fun, is that kids that age haven't developed, like, a filter yet. So, like, if you get a kid before high school, and even a handful of kids after high school and even into college, I've had some friends, but they'll just say whatever they're thinking about. So it's both, like, sometimes absolutely bizarre, but sometimes really insightful and interesting. So I love it that it sounds like a really hard question because I have no idea how I would respond to that, but it sounds interesting.
It's been a fun time with all the questions from him, but also like, okay, God, how am I supposed to answer this question now? And I have to come up with it like right now because he's going to ask it again if I don't answer it right now.
I mean, yeah, that makes me think of, like, kind of how we're raised and talk how, like, the virtue of having, like, faith like a child or being childlike in your faith is held up quite a bit as kind of an ideal. And it's like, man, yeah, kids will just kind of say whatever and not have that filter and persist, if they're confused by the answer or something. Maybe that's okay when we just in prayer or whatever just say whatever's on our mind without filtering it and trying to make it sound so perfect. And maybe it's okay to persist. And maybe it's okay to just not have that. I mean, like, not having a filter in prayer. Look at a lot of the Psalms. Those
Mhm.
David clearly didn't have a filter when he was writing many of those.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, as someone who's a writer, do you find yourself picking different stories or having certain stories that you really are excited to share with your child or children, or even ones that, like, aren't age appropriate yet because they're maybe just a little too complex, but that you'd really like to share one day? Like, and as an example, I don't have a kid yet, but I can't wait to share, like, The Lord of the Rings with a potential possible future offspring that I have.
Yeah.
Like, I might be way too excited and start reading them The Lord of the Rings day 1.
Yeah, that might be a little bit too young. They won't understand it yet. Um, but, yeah, my son has really gotten into audiobooks lately, and which is really nice because then I don't have to read them out loud, all of these books. So I've actually got him started on some, I guess technically they'd be considered more middle grade books. Of course, we started with things like Beatrix Potter and Winnie the Pooh. But then, after so long of listening to those, I'm like, let's find something different.
I'm guessing your kid is the same as many kids where they'll just rewatch or re-listen to the same thing
Mhm.
over and
Oh,
over
yeah.
and over and
He's
over and over again.
Yeah, he has listened to Stuart Little and Winnie the Pooh probably a dozen times each almost. Winnie the Pooh for sure, probably a dozen times. Stuart Little might not quite be up there yet.
Nice. I bet there's some sort of spiritual lesson in that concept of rewatching something over and over again. I'm not sure what that is yet, but
Me
maybe that
neither.
will maybe that will spark an idea in one of our audience members' minds. So if you think of the lesson, leave it in the comments below. In your time kind of guiding other writers, uh, you and I have both worked, or currently work as advisors for other students in the author conservatory. Have you found any spiritual lessons through that, or seen God at work kind of through other people's lives, in your time doing that?
I think one of the main things is just going back to that persistence that we were talking about earlier. Even when things get hard, obviously don't burn yourself out. But that's one thing that we should also be learning. But but also just kind of staying persistent without burning out in whatever it is that we're working on. As long as the story itself is working or the project itself is working. If it's not working, then you might have to take a step back and reevaluate. But for the most part, I think it's just I don't know. When you were talking about persistence earlier, the story in the Gospels of the persistent widow who kept going back to the judge and back and back. And finally, the judge is like, "Okay, fine. I will hear you out. I will do whatever it is you want. Just go away." Just kind of being that persistent widow and just going back to whatever it is that you're supposed to be working on, that God has called you to do.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great way to kind of connect the conversation from earlier about children with kind of creativity. I love it. Yeah, and I mean, like, that fits really well with kind of looking at, we're recording this at the very, very tail end of 2024. Um, so I know for myself, I've been thinking a lot about goals for the new year, and persistence is definitely a topic that connects with goals. And regardless of when this episode airs in 2025 here, persistence is still going to be something that everyone's going to be able to value. And who knows, maybe episode is coming at a time when one of our listeners maybe set forth some really awesome goals right at the start of the year, but life's happen, complications of some sort have arisen, and they've struggled to keep up with it. And maybe they need that reminder of, you know what, it's okay. Just take a deep breath, take a second to catch your breath, and then get back and persist forward. Faith, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really fun to chat with you. I love it that going into a conversation like this, it wasn't necessarily on my radar to talk a lot about kids and kind of viewing life through raising a kid and how do you communicate with a kid, but I found it really helpful. Thank you for joining us. You can support the show by going to our Patreon page at patreon.com/story516. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. We look forward to seeing you next time.